Rabbi Tovia Singer, thank you for joining us. Right now, American Jewry is in shock. New York just elected Zohran Mamdani, a Shia 12er Muslim. Fear is spreading, and many Jews are beginning to feel like, is this the end of an American chapter?
Sure, of course. So we're told explicitly in the Torah, in the two places you would predict, what's called a Teichacha, Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, the blessings and the curses. So we're told explicitly when the Jewish people go into exile, the Torah says, and I will scatter you among the nations, I will draw out a sword against you. Leviticus 26, verse 33. The same thing, we have the same idea conveyed in Deuteronomy 28, verse 64 and 65, that the nations where you will go, you will have no rest. That's fairly transparent to us that if the Jews had gone to the Korean peninsula, particularly the southern part, or if we had gone to China or Japan or the Far East, we wouldn't be dealing with this. But throughout our exile, we have been hated by the nations where we lived, which had multiple effects, which Chazal anticipated and Tanakh talk about. Number one, it means that the Jewish people would still be in Gullus and be very aware that we're in exile. It's very hostile. And number two is our sages tell us that it prevents anti-Semitism, prevents Jews from assimilating because we're constantly reminded by our adversaries who we are, what we are, and that is that we're hated. The election of this mayor, Mamdani, who, as you said, is a Shia, which is an iteration of Islam, which holds the Jew in the most contempt, meaning, it's a very strange thing, but meaning they hold that Jews are mamish tameh, translate that are literally impure. If a Jew touches food, that food becomes inedible. Sunnis, which comprise 90% of the Islamic world, do not view Jews in that fashion. Next prophecy, which is very critical because we're seeing something very odd that's happening, something we're observing, the spectacle that it's not only that we're observing something that's really very striking in the largest, most populous Jewish city in the world. There are more Jews living in New York City than any other city in the world. There's no city in Eretz Yisrael that has as many Jews as New York. It's impossible to ignore that. But Mamdani is coming from the left. That's his appeal. But what we thought is that, well, we can certainly rely on our good friends, the Americans, who are on the right. After all, Donald Trump has been an extraordinary friend to Israel, and we are very grateful for what he did in taking out Iran's nuclear facilities that Israel simply didn't have the ability to hit. He and his father are both people who have a genuine love for the Jews. And he said it openly. He said, "You Jews who are going to vote for Mamdani, you must be crazy." He said it's very hard to argue with him. But what's very striking, what has emerged, is also a brand of visceral anti-Semitism on the right, in the conservative right, which people weren't expecting from the Republican Party, which no one was expecting. The emergence of Tucker Carlson, who worked for Fox News for a quarter of a century, very successful, and once he was fired, was released to uh, exp- and it's very interesting. He's a very attractive presenter in the manner that he has, in that the way he launders the most vile anti-Semites and Holocaust deniers is simply by interviewing them. And these are puff interviews where there's no pushback, where he's simply laundering their ideas and saying, I'm just asking questions. Having Nick Fuentes on. Nick Fuentes was just on Tucker Carlson's show, and he was on for hours. He's a Nazi. He's a guy who said, I like Stalin. He said he's a fan of Stalin, and there was no pushback. Stalin was one of the most evil people in the 20th century, responsible for probably 20 to 30 million people killed. He allied himself with Hitler in 1939. Hitler, in the Barbarossa, violated that agreement, and in a way, it saved us because he attacked the Russian, he attacked the Eastern Front. So that was the mistake that Hitler made that ultimately led to the downfall of the Third Reich. But what is consequential is here you have Tucker, who is simply bringing on people who state that Churchill was really the great villain of World War II. Bringing on Fuentes is shocking. And then you have other people who are coming from an iteration of Roman Catholicism that are virulently anti-Semitic, that are just simply naming the Jews. Mamdani is sort of hiding it because he's saying, I have nothing against the Jews. He went into a sukkah during Sukkot. It was a very stupid thing for those guys in Satmar to do this. Very stupid. I don't want to discuss the theology of Zionism with Satmar. That's not relevant. But it was not the way of Satmar to ever ally itself with people who support terrorism, who support terrorist organizations. Neturei Karta does that, and that's why they are looked upon as the crazies of our people. That means they're not even considered our people. The people who ally themselves with terrorists. So this was something that Satmar never did, and the Satmar Rebbe opposed this completely. And what one group in Satmar did was very, very damaging, and they have to do tshuva for what they did. But the key point is that we're seeing this explosion. Yeah, we were talking about Candace Owens. So it's interesting that the Catholic Church now just celebrated, in fact, tonight in Yerushalayim at the Notre Dame Center, which is right outside the Old City, the 60th anniversary of Nosha Atete, which is the result of the Second Vatican Council that began in let's say about 1960, it ended in 1965. And the key, most well-known, certainly most controversial document is a document called In Our Time, in which it refutes, it's a positive document. It does not undo everything, but it does say that the Jews are not responsible for killing Jesus, that we're not to be called a treacherous Jew in their prayers, in their Good Friday prayers, whatever. It was a positive document. But there are people who despise the Second Vatican Council, the real anti-Semites. And unfortunately, Candace Owens, when she married her husband, his name is George Farmer, she was a Calvinist, someone who held to Reformed theology. It doesn't matter what that means, but the thing is, she was a Protestant. But she joined her husband's version of Catholicism, which is called SSPX. Do you want me to explain what this all means? Probably so.
Yeah,
But
sure. It sounds great.
I'll explain. SSPX means a Society of Saint Pius X. The date, January 25th, 1904. The meeting is between Theodore Herzl and Pope Pius X. Herzl, on a fool's errand, asked Pius X that the Vatican should recognize Israel. He said, we're not only not going to recognize Israel, you don't recognize our Savior, we're not going to recognize your state. And while we can't prevent Jews from coming to Palestine, when you come, we'll have priests waiting to baptize you. It was unbelievable. So the people who love Pius X and reject the Second Vatican Council, and that's called the SSPX Roman Catholics. They're all virulent anti-Semites like Gibson. Now, what does this have to do with what we're talking about? We're warned in Tanakh explicitly by a very unique Navi, a very unique prophet. His name, Ezekiel, who lived at a very striking time. He lived during the destruction of the first temple. His Sefer, 48 chapters, could be divided into three massive segments. Very famous very famous segment of Ezekiel is a segment of Yemos HaMashiach, as an example. We have the unused blueprints of the third temple in the book of Ezekiel. I appeal to the viewers to read it from Ezekiel 40 through 48. We have a segment of Ezekiel that is devoted to tell us that the Shekhinah will always be with the Jewish people. Remember, he's living at a time when it's not just a building that destroyed the first temple, it's the first commonwealth was destroyed by the Babylonian Empire, by Nebuchadnezzar. But the part that's very critical, that's germane to our conversation, is the part where Ezekiel explains why the first temple was destroyed. This is very unique to Ezekiel, where he devotes chapters of explaining what was going on in the first temple, I mean the end of the first temple period. This is the temple that was built by King Solomon 410 years earlier, and to explain to us what will exile look for you. And what he says is something fascinating. He addresses of how the Jews will be treated if they're exiled. Ordinarily, when a people are not liked, when a minority are disliked by the host nation, as an example, Irish and Italians came to the United States in very large numbers, like Jews, at the end of the 19th century. And they were hated in America. In fact, it may be the largest lynching that ever occurred in the United States, or one of the largest lynchings that ever occurred, was to Italian Americans. In 1891, after the police chief in New Orleans was murdered, they blamed it on the Italians. About 10,000 Americans gathered up the Italians. They took them from prison. Don't ask. People who weren't even put on trial, and they lynched 11 Italians. It's very famous. And even the New York Times reported it as something, well, these are the kind of people we're dealing with here. You have to get rid of your riffraff. The Irish were hated as well. But what we're all very aware of today is no one has negative feelings towards the Irish or Italians. They proudly march in parades up Fifth Avenue on their, what happened? So what happened to the Irish and Italians is that they both, as an example, they participated in the American experiment. Civically, they contributed enormously. And they demonstrated to Americans that we're just like you. That's true. We have, different foods and a special culture and a special thing. That's all fascinating. But we're committed to the United States. And therefore, today, whatever hatred was focused on Irish, and there were plenty of jobs in university Irish could not get into. Irish were not welcome to, don't ask. But today, these things do not exist. Why? Because the dislike of the unlike recedes when the minority group behaves like the host. However, Yechezkel says this phenomenon does not apply to Klal Yisrael. It's a very important chapter. It's Ezekiel chapter 20, where Yechezkel addresses what your experience will be like for the Jew. And Yechezkel says, just remember this, as you remember, again, our time, Ezekiel is living during the Babylonian exile. He's living during the time of the destruction of the first temple, and the Jews are now 90% are going to Bavel, and 10% will wind up in North Africa. And he says to them, the words of Rambi of verse 32 through 34. He says, do not think for a moment. He says, let it not go up on your mind. He says that how will we escape persecution and exile? So this sociological phenomena we didn't just discover it. Everyone knew if you act like the host country, eventually persecution ends. He says, no, it'll be the reverse for you. Yechezkel says that if you will try this out, in the nations that you will be driven to, where you'll say, let us be like the other nations, Hashem says, then the fiercest kind of hatred will explode. And that's what he continued. Then I'm going to bring you out to the wilderness and you will face destruction. So and what is very striking, I remember I had to read Mein Kampf, written by Hitler Yamach Shemai in 1934 when he was in prison. And unfortunately, it's extremely readable. I mean, he didn't. He wrote it in German. I read it in English a few times to prepare myself to write my books. And in his first chapter, he very clearly, it's a very lucid work. It's not like the ranting of a crazy person like Nick Fuentes. He very clearly describes how before he moved to Vienna, he thought that the Jews were just another religion among, just like you have Catholics, you have Protestants, Jews were just another way. He said he realized, he says, in the streets of Vienna, he saw a Jew with side locks and a special hat, and then, which he knew, of course, was a Jew, but then he interacted with Jews who dressed just like everyone else, and he realized that they were, in fact, they were like a cancer that was infecting society. The most dangerous people to Adolf Hitler were the Jews who pretended to be like one of us, who were infiltrating our society, who are our misery, our Unglück, and in fact, we had to deal with this problem by eviscerating, by destroying them, because they are infiltrating our society and marrying our women, even worse, and so on. So we're observing a spectacle on both the left and the right in the United States, the most successful experiment for Jewish life, where Jews have full equality with non-Jews, which really never existed in history. And here we're seeing from both ends a massive problem. Tucker Carlson, I can't emphasize this enough, is a very dangerous person. It's not only because he's very attractive and he brings with him a success from Fox News, but he's also quite close to his son, works for J.D. Vance as a senior press advisor, a senior advisor to the vice president of the United States. So and I think that's why the Heritage Center defended him and his choice for not only interviewing Nick Fuentes, who's just out of his mind, he's just a neo-Nazi, but not pushing back at all. And you look at the difference between that and when Tucker Carlson interviewed the senator from Texas, Ted Cruz, and how he attacked him. So this is something that Tanakh is predicting, and it's something that we're seeing emerging today.
Okay, wow. Well, thank you. So what does that mean practically for a Jew watching this right now? What can we do right now?
In truth, I can, there's a very interesting Gemara that describes the exile of the first temple and then Ezra, and why that the Mashiach could have come in the days of Ezra. It didn't happen because the Jewish people ger machet. The Marsha says on this, it's a Gemara in Yuma, Daf Tes Amud Aleph. It's a Gemara in Brachos, Daf Dalid. The Marsha says that why was God so angry? I just want to explain the context of the Gemara in both of these places. There were three Nevi'im. When we say Nevi'im Achronim today, that's a misnomer. It's really a mistake. It's a 500-year-old mistake that everything from Yeshaya on is called Nevi'im Achronim, the latter prophets. This is a complete error. In as far as Chazal were concerned, the Nevi'im Achronim were three individuals: Chagai, Zechariah, Chagai, and Malachi. Those three Nevi'im, those three prophets, lived during the Persian Empire. They lived during the time of Ezra. They lived during time when the Second Temple was being rebuilt. And the Gemara addresses why did we need these Nevi'im? Because it was possible that Mashiach would come during the days of Ezra, and if you build a Beis Hamikdash, you need Nevi'im. So they were there on standby in case Mashiach would have come then. It's very critical. How come Mashiach didn't come? So the Marsha explains what the Gemara says. And that is because the vast majority of the Jews did not return back to Israel, to the land of Israel when they could. In fact, you should know, we have a chapter in Tanakh. It's in the book of Ezra, chapter 2, You know what chapter 2 is? Chapter 2 of Ezra enumerates every single family, every Jew that returned to the land of Israel.
32,436, is that right?
42,360 Jews
Okay,
returned to Israel. Yeah, it's unbelievable. So it's I'll tell you something very interesting. I'll tell you something interesting. I want the viewers to understand this. So our sages asked, so every family is named there, every family by name, we're told. And how many of this is the name of the family and how many of their. Now, you should know that that was the first aliyah, which means Cyrus, who opens up the book of Ezra, he begins with his soliloquy of saying, as a nevuah, he's got to tell the Jews to go back. So that was only the first aliyah, the first wave. I mean, the Jews came from Bavel. There was nothing here in Israel. There was no Jewish life. For 50 years, from Churban Bayis Rishon, I should say that in English, from the destruction of the first temple until the Jews returned was Nun Shana, was 50 years. There was no Jews in Israel, unless they were hiding. So 42,360 Jews come to nothing, and they begin the project of building the second temple, the second commonwealth. Now, they came, there was nothing here. There was nothing here. But the Persian Empire was there. The Babylonian Empire was destroyed. Come back. Now, subsequently, it's very interesting that there were other aliyot, which means other subsequent waves that occurred years later. 8 years later, 12 years later, more Jews come back when the second commonwealth is being built. There are, of course, hiccups along the way, and that's Nehemiah, a lot of the problems that go on, but the second commonwealth is already there. It's interesting that we're only given the names of those Jews who came before the second Beis Hamikdash was built. And it's interesting that Chazal look at that in a way that the Jews who came, it's like comparing it to the Jews who will come after the Messiah comes, meaning we know from Tanakh that all the Jews will return to the land of Israel in the days of Mashiach. Isaiah 43, verse 5 and 6 is an example, Ezekiel 37. But there will be a special status for the Jews who come before Mashiach comes. Very interesting. Now, the Zohar says that the Jews who come to Eretz Yisrael, before Mashiach comes, they're going to have wings. I don't know, and I'm not going to pretend to know what that means, but it's a special status if you came before Mashiach. So I just want to say to my brothers and sisters around the world, it's time to come home and to come now. And if you don't, then we have free will. We have Bechira Chavshi. So, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be His name, will of course adjust what is occurring. And the Jews who live in Antwerp and the Jews who live in the 5 towns are very cognizant of what's occurring. And therefore, there's a movement. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is pushing. That's the whole idea of Mashiach ben Yosef, which means pressure, and Jews are realizing that it's time to come back. So there's nothing I could say more importantly. I mean, before the Holocaust, but Hitler comes to power in 1933. There were many people, unfortunately, said, don't go to Palestine. It's dangerous. Palestine's going to go up in flames. I'm talking from the Jewish world. And Eretz Yisrael was the safe place to be during World War II. Rommel's tanks were destroyed. He wasn't able to proceed to Israel and carry out what Hajamin al-Husseini, Yimach Shemai, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, planned, that Hitler's armies would come to the land of Israel and kill all the Jews here. Even though there were swastikas, there were swastik flags with swastikas flying in Jerusalem where the Templars are, but the Jews were safe here in the land of Israel. So it's time for the Jews to come home. That's what's really going on. That you feel confident and comfortable, and the Republican Party, and this is where our friends are. To be very, very careful. And it's happening really in a way that's so transparent now. And it's coming from mainstream. from the Republican Party. And here we watch the Heritage Center, a think tank, come out and defend Tucker Carlson in a way that was really extraordinary. And my gratitude goes out to those Christians who are part of that think tank, who resigned, who are Christians, who said, we want nothing to do with this. But we need to know that the events that are occurring now, that are coming from the left and from the right, are a sign for the Jews that it's time to come back to Israel. Right now is the time.
Thank you. There's something different about the anti-Semitism of today than even 50 years ago. And I'll explain that in Chutz La'aretz now, when there's anti-Semitism, first of all, it's the first time I remember a Muslim, 12er who's like the same religion as Iran, becoming, and interestingly enough, this morning on Wiki, it still said that he was a 12er. And then when I checked just before the meeting, I did not see that it had been taken down. So somebody made that change. And like, what does this really mean now that the Jews have a place to go? I know, like, he took down the gates that were stopping people from making Aliyah, and it was, and the Medrash Eicha says that it was a big question, a taina on Klal Yisrael, that now that they can go make Aliyah, they could come for Aliyah L'Regel, and they didn't come. So that was much worse when they couldn't come. All the years we couldn't come, and now I think for the first time we're really experiencing something anti-Semitism that we haven't never witnessed. I'm just wondering if you could just shed some light on what the difference today is. Thank you.
Yeah, Zohran Mamdani is a Shia Muslim. The center of Shia Islam is Iran. Iran has been the center of Shia Islam since the 16th century. And Shia Islam, there are no Shias here in Israel, none at all. There are in Lebanon, there are in Qatar, there are in Kuwait, there are in Iraq, but the center of it all, the power of it all, is really is Iran. In their view, Jews are, and this is what's germane to this point, in their view, Jews are filthy. In their view, Jews are intrinsically, inherently dirty, are tameh, using a Hebrew word. In fact, there were many times it depends who led Iran, where if it rained in Iran, in Tehran, Jews were not allowed to go outside. They had to stay in their house. Why? Lest the rain hit a Jew, and then the water splashes off of him and touches a Shia Muslim. He becomes unclean. If the water hits a Jew, and that water then touches food of a Muslim, of a Shia Muslim, he's not allowed to eat it. The Sunni Muslims do not hold to this at all. It's strange, but Sunnis, I know many of them, and I'm interviewed on Muslim Channel, will tell me personally that they hold that Judaism is closer to them than Shia Islam. Sunnis hold that Shia is complete idolatry, a complete avodah zarah. However, the split, it should be just, I'll take 10 seconds. The split between Shia and Sunni happened very rapidly after Muhammad's death, and it was not a theological breakaway, but rather it was completely political. Who would head the Islamic caliphate after the death of Muhammad? So it's important to note that although today there are theological distinctions between the roughly 10% of the Islamic world, Shia, and 90% of the Islamic world, Sunni. Now, I'm overgeneralizing. There are other Islamic groups, but these are the two big ones. It began political, but it shifted off where Shia Islam, which this America's New York City's future mayor is a member of, has a very dark view of the Jews. And you could just look at Persia for a moment. Think about it. It has no border with the land of Israel. You could say in Syria, they're angry. The Jews have the Golan Heights. They lost a number of wars, but Iran doesn't have such a war and doesn't have any. There's no basis for them to be at war with Israel. We know they're roughly 1,000 kilometers east of Israel. They're not Arabs. It's one of the biggest insults you can call an Iranian. Tell him he's an Arab. They don't like it. So Shia Islam, or the you refer to them as 12, this is an iteration of Islam that is inherently more hostile uh, to Jews, inherently. But from the, it's intriguing. I'll just share this one thought. It's that same book of Ezekiel, same Sefer Yechezkel, that tells us that at the end of days, that Persia will lead the coalition of nations against Eretz Yisrael, against Yerushalayim. You'll find that in Ezekiel 38 and 39, the Haftorah that we read on Sukkot, because the Gemara in Megillah tells us that that Mashiach ben Yosef, or Mechemes Gog uMagog, this end time war, begins on Sukkot. So this is very striking. And I just as a caveat, at the time when these oracles were articulated, Persia was a benign nation. I mean, it was not they did not pose a threat to the Jewish people. And throughout the Sasanian Empire, the Persian Empire, Jews had it good. The Gemara, the Babylonian Talmud, was written under the Sasanian Empire, and life was very comfortable for them, in contrast to what the Jews were enduring under the Roman Empire, which was absolute nightmare in the Byzantine Empire, in the eastern part of the empire. I just want to convey this to the viewer. Something very intriguing about prophecy is, unlike the person who's the weather person on telling you what the weather's going to be like. He's not a Navi. The person who's telling you what it'll rain tomorrow, whatever it's going to be, he's studying maps, satellite imagery, and he's extrapolating from that what's the weather likely to be like tomorrow and the next day after that. In Tanakh and in Chazal, in the words and the oracles of our prophets and sages of blessed memory, there's nothing they could have been looking at the time and extrapolate that at the end of days we're going to face an implacable enemy for no apparent reason that's going to be the opponent of Israel, the land of Israel. There was nothing happening back then that would have implied this. And yet here we are with the enemy of our people, who we share no border with, who are not Yishmael, where Yishmael and Isaac had a tenuous relationship. They worked it out at the end of their lives when Yishmael gave Kadimus to Yitzchak in Genesis chapter 25, verse 9, and the Talmud tells us that Ishmael repented, and from there we infer that the Bnei Ishmael will turn back and join us and do tshuva, and we look forward to that. This does not apply to Persia, does not apply to Iran. So in my view, what we're seeing is we're getting hit from both sides, and as you said correctly, it's something that none of us have witnessed in our lifetimes.
Appreciate you taking the time and joining us on this channel. Maybe you could lead us out with a prayer.
Yeah, we're living in an extraordinary time. We are, I never had this conversation with you and you, the viewer, but I imagine that when we're in Eretz Yisrael, we wonder to ourselves aloud, why we and not our great-great-grandparents, who could not have imagined that we would live in such a remarkable moment in history. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu should lead us by his light to unify us as one nation with one heart, as the children of Israel had when they came to the land of Israel to rebuild the second temple. Now we're at the precipice of building the third commonwealth. As Amos, who was a great prophet, lived during the time of Isaiah, tells us at the end of his Sefer in chapter 9, verse 14 or 15, that once the Jews are restored back to the land of Israel, they will be planted and will never be uprooted again. We should be zecher to see the Gula Shalema, the true redemption, quickly in our time, where all the nations will speak Besafa Bruda, will speak in a pure speech, as Seifania describes, who lived here in Yerushalayim as well. So we look forward to that. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you, Rabbi Singer. Shavua Tov, good Shabbos.
Shabbos.
You know, I did not record that section.
I did, as it turns out.